I'm Dr. Mark Merriwether Vorderbruggen. I'm here today at Katy Prairie Conservation Land outside of Houston. We are going to start exploring the lands, showing you some of the edible, medicinal, and poisonous plants that are out here. But before we start that, we got to go over the rules and ethics of foraging, because as a forager in the state of Texas, there are 4 things you really need to respect. You need to respect the law, you need to respect the land, you need to respect the plant, and you need to respect yourself. Let me go over each one quickly, starting with respecting the law. Here in the state of Texas, it is illegal to harvest any plant material without the property owner's permission. These laws go back to the sheep and cattle wars of the 1800s, which led to such fascinating inventions as barbed wire fences and repeating revolvers. You may want to keep that in mind. Technically, the only public land in Texas where you are allowed to legally forage is roadsides. So contrary to popular belief, you are allowed to pick the bluebonnets, you're allowed to pick any plant along the Texas roadsides, but that's really the only place you can pick it. Here at the Nature Preserve, it would be totally forbidden to pick any plants, though today we do have special permission. Second one, respect the land. For that, just simply leave no trace. I spend a lot of time out in the wilds of Texas, and I keep discovering people leaving their water bottles and their candy wrappers and stuff like that. Please don't do that. Respect the land. Third, respect the plant, and with that it means how you go about harvesting when you are in a place. So going back to the Texas roadsides, you are only allowed to take the aerial parts of the plant. You are not allowed to dig it up. As far as how much of the plant you take, if you go to my website, www.foragingtexas.com, there are over 225 plants on there currently. Each has an abundance code. And that abundance code then tells you how much of the plant you can pick. You know, whether it's invasive plant, plentiful, common, uncommon, rare, endangered. They all have different levels of how much you can take. And then finally, with respect the plant, the way you go about doing it, you want to always make sure you have a nice sharp pocket knife or pruning shears or something like that to minimize the damage to the plant. Because around here, there's a lot of fungus in the air. If you just tear a plant open, the fungus can get in there and kill it. We don't want that. Then finally, the last one, respect yourself. And by this, I simply mean, please don't eat anything poisonous. When you're looking at a plant and trying to decide what it is, I tell people you want to match at least 5 structural features of the plant with whatever guide you are using, whatever book or website or app or anything like that. So you want to make sure you properly identified the plant before eating it. Also along those lines, you want to make sure the environment in which the plant is growing is also safe. In most cases, the main issues will be things like pesticides, fire ant killers, depending on what part of Texas you're in. Like in East Texas, over in the old iron mining areas, the soil there can be naturally contaminated with mercury in some places, and of course industrial chemicals depending on where you are. So you kind of have to know what's in the land itself to understand what may be in the plant. All right, so let's get going. Unfortunately, Texas waters have been invaded by a plant called the water hyacinth, which is always hard to say. And it is generally a floating plant that floats around in the water. It has these big pads, bladders that help it float. It's a beautiful purple flower. The problem is it spreads insanely. Once it shows up, it starts filling the pond, and you're out of luck. It is illegal to transport it, so if you see some, you can't just take it and go home with it. You have to eat it on site, because the edible parts, let me get a pocket knife here. Always have your pocket knife. It's basically almost like a water chestnut. Where these cores are cooked up. Any plant you take from the water, you definitely need to cook, just so you don't get any bacteria on it. You don't eat it raw, especially off the edge of a knife. So treat them like water chestnuts. And like I said, thin sliced, use them in sautés, do a beachside stir fry, be good there. And it will actually help Texas because we are overrun with these things and we need to get rid of them. In a lot of Texas wetland areas, damp, moist areas, both shade and sun, we have different varieties of smartweed. And it is called smartweed because it kind of smarts when you eat it. It is loaded with the same hot compounds that are in hot peppers. So if you want to add a spicy, fiery flair to your food, you pick off the leaves of the smartweed and add them in there, just like a hot pepper. On the smartweed, you will notice that the leaves are alternating, and there's a little sheath that runs from where the leaf connects up the stem, and up at the very top at the end will be these little spikes of white flowers. It's a very distinctive plant. There aren't any real poisonous mimics, so if you're not sure, you can take just a little bit and nibble on it and see if you get the heat or not. One of the plants I get asked a lot about is dog fennel, because a lot of people see it, to them it looks like fennel, it even smells like fennel, so they assume it must be fennel. And then they start nibbling it, eating it, and it tastes good. What they don't realize is it's actually a poisonous plant. It's not fennel, it's not related to fennel, and it is damaging their liver if they eat too much of it. So dog fennel, there is no wild fennels, edible fennels in Texas. So if you find something that looks like fennel and smells like fennel, most likely it is dog fennel. One thing to remember, fennel has a bulb like an onion. If you were to pull this up, you would see it has a long taproot like a carrot. That's one of the other identifying characteristics to help convince yourself that you should not be eating this. Because it does smell good, especially when it's young. Later on, as it matures, you start to understand why it has the name dog fennel, because it smells like dog urine. So it goes from something that smells really great to something that smells really bad. But dog fennel, do not eat. One of the rules of thumb of foraging is never eat something that looks like a wild pea or wild bean out in the wild. Most of them are very poisonous. So if you can't properly identify it, don't eat the wild bean, don't eat the wild pea. In this case, this is one of the sensibinas, and the seeds, they look edible, they look like a dried bean, but they are very, very poisonous. So just a rule of thumb, if you don't know what it is, even though it looks like a pea or a bean, do not eat it. This is a great one. This is one of the amaranths. There's a bunch of different varieties, species of amaranths in Texas, and they're all edible. Think of this as wild spinach. So the leaves you use just like spinach. Chop them up, cook them up, because they're a little tough. I find cooking tenderizes them some, but once you do that, the taste is very nice. And this is the spiny one. And we are entering the seed season. So right now we still have the flowers, but each one of these flowers will produce a seed, and those seeds are basically kiwa, the grain, the edible grain. So a great plant, a lot of nutrition in it. It has vitamin A, vitamin C, minerals, fiber, and then protein and calories in the seeds. So this is a good plant. A lot of farmers and ranchers don't like it because it can start to spread. But the non-spiny one, unfortunately, this one is the spiny one. The cattle don't like so much, but some of the other ones are actually pretty good fodder for cattle. And also for you. One of the great things about the wild is there are a lot of medicinal plants too. Just some background, I have a master's in medicinal chemistry, a PhD in physical organic chemistry, and so the science is really important to me, especially when it comes to medicinal plants. I like to know there's actual science backing it up. We have two plants here that science say are wonderful as medicinal plants. One is the elderberry. The leaves of the elderberry are compound, which is really a botany term people need to learn if you want to learn foraging, the difference between a compound leaf and a simple leaf. But the main medicinal properties are in the flowers and in the berries. In the leaves and in the stems, there is a small amount of cyanide, so normally you don't do anything with those. The ripe berries are loaded with a class of compounds, anthocyanidins, which are very, very potent antioxidants, which among other things help protect your DNA from damage from free radicals, which can lead to cancer. They can also help break up the plaque that will collect in your arteries and your blood vessels. Ripe, you don't want to eat the berries. You want to let them age, dry, or cook the berries, or make a syrup or a tincture or something like that out of them, because there are some small amounts of really bad flavored chemicals that are also somewhat toxic that have to evaporate away from the berries before you use them. But internally and externally, the elderberry is an amazing medicinal plant. And right underneath it, we have lantana. A lot of people know of lantana used in landscaping, beautiful plant, butterflies and bees like the flowers. And if you ever crush some of the leaves, you'll know it smells really good. The thing is about lantana is taken internally, it's very, very poisonous. But externally, the crushed leaves are compounds that speed up the healing of wounds. A few days ago, I actually had a terrible bicycle crash, and one leg is one big mass of road rash. And so I've been crushing up the lantana leaves and putting it on it, and it's greatly sped up the healing. So I'm really excited about that. I had a chance to test it in the real world. But lantana, the leaves, the crushed up leaves for external wounds, you mash them up and then just press them against the wound, let them sit there for 15-20 minutes, do that 3 times a day. And the compounds from that almost work as a hormone for the human body that tells the skin cells, hey, you're damaged, you know how you're healing? Let's speed that process up some. So pretty amazing. You can also make a wash from it, because the particular compounds are water soluble, so you can collect the leaves now, dry them, and then later on, if you have some sort of skin wound, you can soak the leaves, make a tea out of it, and then apply the tea as a wash, in a gauze or something to the wound, and it does speed up the healing. The invasive species across Texas prairies is called the Cherokee rose or the McCarthy rose. It is in the rose family, so it has all the food and medicine benefits of a rose, but unfortunately it spreads really well. Cattle and so forth don't like it. But right now we are loaded with the rose hips, and that is the fruit of the rose. So they almost look like persimmons with the little cap there, but this is the calyx. The bloom came off the top of this, and this used to hold the bloom. But the nice thing about these is they are absolutely loaded with vitamin C. And so they have a long history of being used to make a tea or jelly, jam, things like that. One of the things you need to remember though is the seeds of the rose hip. You generally want to remove those. It's always important to have a little cutting board with you. The flesh of the rose hips is loaded with vitamin C. But the seeds, you want to remove those because the seeds are coated with fine hairs, which are okay on the way in, but on the way out they can be somewhat of an irritant. So it's best to always remove the seeds before you use the fruit for any sort of tea or jam or anything like that. After removing the seeds, then you just chop it up and then put it in hot water. Remember, vitamin C actually starts to decompose if you heat it up above 180 degrees. So the best thing to do is bring your water to a boil without the rose hip in it, take it off, let it cool down for about 5 minutes, then add the chopped up rose hips. Let them sit in there for 15 to 30 minutes, then strain them out and drink it for the vitamin C rich tea. The plants I'm always excited to find is ball moss for multiple reasons. One, it's a great indicator plant of the overall cleanliness of the land and the location. Ball moss is not a parasite, it's an aerophyte. It's taking all its nutrients from the air, the dew, the rain, and using that to grow. It's just using the trees as support. It's not taking anything from the trees. But if there's anything bad in the air, these things won't be here. They can't handle it. And so it's an indication of clean air, which usually is a good indication of clean soil. Now, as far as an edibility, so these brown parts are the seed pods, so it flowered and has already ejected its seeds out into the wild. The edible parts are these smaller grayish strands. Think of them as very thin celery. And you just take some and munch them. What's neat about this plant is if you just, take it off the tree and put it in your bathroom in a sunny window, the moisture from the shower and all that will be enough to keep it growing. But more importantly, science has found there's some amazing anti-cancer properties in the ball moss. And so for that reason, I've added it to my daily diet just as a cancer preventative. Very interesting stuff on that. People don't realize the plant similar to it that you're probably most common or most used to is the pineapple. They're both bromeliads, so this is in the same family as the pineapple, but it does not taste like pineapple, unfortunately. There's a pineapple flavored cancer preventative, would be pretty awesome. Instead, we got a celery flavored cancer preventative, which is pretty good too. One of the issues with the prairie is it's starting to be overrun with invasive species, such as this Chinese tallow tree. But it was exciting to find on this particular Chinese tallow tree some wood's ear mushrooms. If you've had hot and sour soup, the mushrooms in that are these mushrooms, also known as the black mushrooms. On the wood's ear mushroom, you'll see the underside is this dark brown, and then the top side, it's actually a fuzzy gray. So that's one of the indicators. But it forms these shelf-like mushrooms all along dead wood. That's another one of the indicators that they grow on dead wood. They particularly like elderberry, but they also like the Chinese tallow tree and some elm trees. They generally do not like pine trees, but some of the softer woods that are easy to break apart, because that's what they're doing. They're breaking down the wood and returning all the nutrients to the soil. These are an edible jelly mushroom, and right now these are kind of desiccated and dry. But if you were to drop this in hot water, it would swell up like one of those magic pellets that turns into a dinosaur, except in this case, it would end up looking like an ear, almost to the point that it's somewhat creepy like. But that's then sliced up and thrown in your hot and sour soup. If you like cup of soup at lunch and you have these, you can just slice these up and throw them in your cup of soup. Good stuff. So the frog fruit is a normal ground cover, creeps along the ground. If we look at the leaves, we see they have opposite alternating leaves, but this is an amazing plant. As food, it's okay. Think of it as a spinach substitute, the leaves, the stems. You do want to cook it just to soften it up some, but what's really amazing is it as a medicine. So the leaves, the stem, the fruit are all loaded with this really interesting antiviral compound that seems to interfere with viral replication once the virus has infected a cell. So kind of normally a virus that would get into a cell, hijack the machinery of the cell to start making more viruses. There are compounds from the frog fruit that prevent the virus from doing that. As you learn about nature and plants, as you develop yourself as a forager, you start realizing you need to know the plants at different parts of their life cycle. So what we have here is dried horse mint. Very distinctive. You can see how it has these balls of where the flowers used to be. I spotted this from 100 feet away. At this point, it still has use, because if you take these and crush them up and smell them, it still has that horse mint smell. That particular compound is a chemical called thymol. And thymol, it's a fairly potent mint-like molecule, but it's also a very strong antibiotic. So the tea made from the horse mint has a long history of being used for internal and external bacterial infections, but it also tastes good. But it's just one of the many things they have out here on the prairie. You'll see pictures of what it looks like when it is actually flowering. It's a very beautiful flower. All around what's called the disturbed areas where mankind has kind of tore things up some and then walked away, you will find braggon all across North America, from Connecticut down to California up into Alaska. It didn't always used to be that way. This actually originally was only found out in the New England area of the North American continent, and there it was actually used for food. The ragweed seeds are plentiful, and they're loaded with oil. Oil is calories, calories was life, and it grew
grew really well in all sorts of soil conditions, so it actually was domesticated and grown as an agricultural crop by a number of the Native American tribes. It became a trade good, and because it was such a rich source of calories and grew everywhere, it ended up being traded all across North America. Here in Texas, the Waco and the Caddo were two of the Native American tribes that actually had agricultural, purposely planted plants. And I believe this was one of them for the seeds. But this all stopped about 1,400 years ago. 1,400 years ago, ragweed was replaced as a staple food crop by corn. And that's when corn showed up. And one of the benefits of corn over ragweed is corn doesn't cause the ragweed allergy like ragweed does. So, great food, but if you are allergic to ragweed, you're going to have all sorts of problems with it. In the Texas prairies, there's lots of wildflowers, and this small, unassuming purple one is often overlooked because it's so small, low to the ground, but it's actually a really neat plant. This is a Vervain. I'm not sure if it's the Texas Vervain or the blue Vervain, but it doesn't really matter from a medicinal point of view because the root is loaded with an agent that helps the brain focus, but also kind of suppresses it some. So like a sedative, a sleep aid sort of thing to kind of stop you from your brain doing this and kind of focus in and then just go to sleep. So the root would be pulled up, chopped up, boiled, and then drank as a tea before going to bed. Another food that used to be important to mankind but no longer is sumpweed. Like the ragweed we saw earlier, the sumpweed seeds are plentiful and loaded with oils and calories, and so they also would be grown for the seeds. Nowadays, they're just a wild kind of ditch plant because they do like the wet areas. Another name for them is the marsh alder because the leaves somewhat look like an alder tree. But mainly, at this stage, we're just waiting for the seeds to appear to collect the seeds for food. We've just entered dove season here in Texas, and hunters like to hunt over this plant. It has many names. Some call it goatweed, some call it doveweed. I like to call it woolly croton. It is in the croton family. It is poisonous to mammals in particular, especially the leaves, which is unfortunate because it has a great smell. But often the difference between medicine and poison is actually dosage, and this plant was used medicinally by Native Americans. The poison is kind of unusual in that it causes the body's ability to thermoregulate pretty much just shut down. So, fevers. The purpose of a fever is to raise the body's temperature above that which bacteria can survive in. And so they realized if people had a fever that were sick, often they got better. So, and they also discovered that a tea made from this, if you gave a person a tea made from the leaves of the woolly croton, had them jump around a bit, get their body temperature up, it shoots up uncontrollably. Then they'd wrap them in some blankets, set them in a corner, and if you were lucky, after 3 days, the temperature only hung out around 104, 105, and that would kill the bacteria and the person would be okay. If it went up 106, 107, 108, then the person probably never came out of it. So penicillin is a much better choice, but this was just one of the many different medicinal plants used. In this case, as a way of driving the fever up.
Go ahead.
All across the Texas fence lines, you will find this spiny, thorny tree. It goes by many names. Simplest prickly ash, based on the prickles, and it is an ash tree. Hercules club, because it looks as they get bigger like something Hercules would use to beat his enemies. Other names include tickle tongue and the toothache tree. And those names probably require a little bit of explanation. But in the young leaves and in the bark is a naturally occurring novocaine. And so if you have a toothache, you would strip some of the bark or take some of the young leaves and chew them into a pulp. While you're doing that, your tongue will start to tingle. But once you have it nice and pulped up, you place it against the young tongue where you have the bad tooth and let it sit there for just a minute or two, and that area will go numb, like you had a shot of novocaine. At that point, your buddy comes and yanks that tooth out, and a few minutes later, the
sensations return, but at least you didn't have the sensation of your tooth being pulled out. So toothache tree, the bark and the young leaves. At this point in the fall, the leaves are already starting to break down and turn yellow, so they're not really useful. But the bark is a really good numbing agent for dental issues. Out on the prairie, it was always really exciting to see a willow tree, because willow trees are a high water tree. They need lots of water close to the surface to grow. So it was indication that there would be a good place to dig a well. So the willow tree as an indicator of what might be under the ground, really important. But the willow tree itself also had a really important medicinal value. And this was discovered and known all around the world, wherever this genus of plants, the Silex was around. The original source of aspirin was the bark of the willows. So in it, there is a molecule in the bark that when you consume it, the stomach acid breaks it into aspirin, and then it has all the pain relief and fever reduction and swelling reduction and so forth that aspirin gives you, because the active ingredient, once the compounds in the bark hit the stomach, is aspirin. The flavor, if you've ever chewed an aspirin, you know it's very, very bitter, but the tea made from the bark, because that's the traditional way of extracting the aspirin precursor molecule, is as a tea, is you find yourself a nice branch about the thickness of a pencil and just shave the bark off. Get yourself about a tablespoon, somewhere between a teaspoon and a tablespoon, boil it in a big mug of water. It will turn a beautiful red color and taste vaguely of wintergreen when you drink it. But then once it gets down into your stomach, the particular ester, that's the type of molecule, gets broken into the acetylsalicylic acid, which is aspirin. All right. A lot of people don't like Yaupon holly. They consider it to be invasive because it does spread well, but it is a native plant, so technically it's not invasive. Scientific name, Ilex vomitoria, or the holly that makes you throw up. There's a really interesting story behind that. Let me say, it doesn't make you throw up. In fact, this used to be a really popular trade good between the region that became Texas and the New England states before they were states. So Ilex vomitoria, or Yaupon holly, turns out it is the only plant in North America, native plant, that produces caffeine. So the leaves of the Yaupon holly have about half the caffeine content of regular tea leaves, but they have all the antioxidants, and they don't have any of the tannins. The tannins are the molecules that make tea bitter. So this makes almost a natural sweet tea because it never turns bitter. So this used to be collected, packed up into bricks, shipped up to New England, where they used it to make tea. The English hated this because it was breaking into the English tea sales, so they started reminding people that, hey, that's Ilex vomitoria, the holly that makes you throw up. You don't want to be drinking this, it's going to make you sick. So almost overnight, because of those lies, the tea market collapsed and English tea took over. Well, the English tea grew more and more popular to the point where the English decided, hey, we can tax the heck out of these people for the tea sales, which led to the American Revolution. So if you think about it, the fact that they were no longer getting a plant from Texas led to the creation of the United States. Pretty cool. So as far as the name Ilex vomitoria, it comes from the first Westerner botanist to discover it, was at the beginning of a religious ceremony by some Native Americans in the area. For several days before the actual ceremony, the Native Americans were drinking lots and lots of tea made from this, and forcing themselves to vomit and dancing around vigorously, just trying to enter an altered state of consciousness. And so this helped them stay awake for those multiple days. So botanists doing what botanists did, they decided to find the crudest name they could find for the plant and came up with Ilex holly vomitoria, holly of vomiting, because that was the distinguishing characteristic that they thought was interesting when they first found this plant. And so it's been cursed with that name ever since. But in the last 5 or 6 years, a number of Texas companies have started
re-offering the Yaupon holly tea, because it really is fantastic. Right, as a forager, learning mushrooms is always exciting because there's a lot of great ones around here. So I'm looking at this one here now. From just what I can see, this could be an edible puffball, it could be a poisonous earth star, or it could be a deadly destroying angel. So I need to look at some more structures. Luckily, it's real easy to do in this case because I just want to pick it. Oh. Come on. Okay, so we're seeing now it's completely round. That's a good sign, but it's feeling kind of mushy. So yeah, what we have, if you see any color or any sort of structures, that's a non-edible mushroom. If I had cut it in half and it looked just like I cut a marshmallow in half, just a homogeneous white all the way through, that would have been an edible puffball. This looks like a puffball that's starting to form the spores. It has a yellow-green color. If it had been black in here, so a white skin with a black inside, that would have been the earth star. And if cutting it in half, you would see gill structures, immature gill structures, that would have been the destroying angel. So it is an edible puffcap if we had found it a few days ago. So this was just a brief introduction to all the wild edible and medicinal plants out across this landscape. We are blessed to have hundreds of them. If you want to learn more, check out the Foraging Texas website, the www.foragingtexas.com. Like I said, on there, there's over 200 plants in great detail, multiple pictures, all the information you need, any mimics, things like that. Also, the Foraging Texas Facebook page, so facebook.com/foragingtexas, where just about every day I post some different interesting plant or plant news or plant science, but things again about edible, medicinal, or poisonous plants. Every morning, 7:30 to 8 a.m. weekday mornings, I should say. Also on the Foraging Texas Facebook page, I have the donut shop at the beginning of the world, which is just a free-form conversation about usually it's plants or science in the news or interesting things like that. Thursday evenings from 8 to 9 is Merriwether's World, where I talk about plants or science or bushcraft or introduce fascinating people that I've met in my career. And again, that's a little more structured than the donut shop at the beginning of the world. And then of course on YouTube, the Dr. Merriwether channel, there are close to 100 hours, maybe probably more than 100 hours at this point, of videos on plants and science and preparedness and all sorts of things that you need to really survive in this modern world or the world of 10,000 years ago. So check those out. Definitely keep an eye on the Katy Prairie Conservation. Hopefully we'll be doing some live classes for them once the whole coronavirus thing ends. All right, thanks and have a great day.